Beresford slide boy, standing throughout a presentation that sometimes felt interminable.
Exciting.
Of course. Moving slides for Morris. So in a sense, having Carl as reluctant amanuensis is very nice treat for me, taking you back. The Tetley family, until the point in 1822 when Joshua found the brewery, had been engaged in several trades, principally as maltsters in Armley, where their maltings, which became grander and grander over the course of the 19th century, were located opposite Armley Lodge, later the site of Branch Road Chapel, which I'm afraid I haven't pursued to get a picture that I can't show you. This maltings remained in family hands until 1882. And although Joshua reduced his engagement in the business as he got older, he drew back from 1854 at the age of 76 and effectively retired 2 years later to the Hollings at Hamsthwaite, questing the edges of the Dales for a quieter life than Armley, presumably. Next, please. The other long-standing brewers of the 18th century, Thomas Chartres, I assume, of Meadow Lane from 1758, Robert Arthington, who'll be well known for you students of Chartres, in Hunslet Lane, 1769, had 4 other companions by the 1790s. Thomas Appleyard and Cools, Humble at Belle Isle, Green in Hunslet, and George Sawyer in Sheepscombe. 6 were still trading in the early 1820s, 7 in 1830, and 10 in 1834. Only Chartres and Arthington were left by the 1860s. Arthington, however, spectacularly converted to teetotalism during his Quaker meeting in 1850, closing his brewery and donating a fortune to overseas missionary work, leaving Josiah unchallenged as the senior brewer in the city. Excellent. By the early 1890s, Leeds, as you can see, had 37 breweries, with 64% of all beer production in the city. There was still a significant number of what we call brewing victuals, who I suppose have just made a sort of comeback with the pub brewed beers. Sheffield and Bradford had 50, with 99% of local beers produced by the commercial brewers. Hull, 33 with 94%, York, 47 with 89%. Now, such figures were not compiled on exactly the same basis. So I'd be happy to talk about the excise system at interminable length if you wish. But they were recorded by excise collections, which were locations based on the principal town of an excise area, but with outridings as well. So you can imagine a man, or usually a man, or a horse, going out to the smaller places to record and test all of the excise. So the excise collections included varying but substantial portions of the hinterlands of these towns. So you can't compare exactly like with like. Leeds accordingly had fewer licenses and more people per license than Sheffield, Bradford and Hull. Far fewer than both Liverpool and Manchester, but much the same fairly random reasons. So the statistics, for those who are keen on such things, are not terribly clear. Next, please. The temperance movement, as we've seen foreshadowed by the spectacular change of Robert Arthington, was gathering in strength, and this altered market conditions. And those of you who know, as we do, Thorsby members, Leeds was a particularly important place in the temperance region. As a result, brewers everywhere felt the need to control their retail outlets effectively, vertically integrating to retain markets and market share. Thus, the 1890s were thus the point at which sharp competition was being demonstrated. Apologies about the random square bracket, but coincided with the growth of more limited liability in companies and the development of public access to their shares at relatively modest prices. The result was what one business historian has called bubbles in beer. I think she may have thought better of that, having published that article with a rather twee title. The rise of popular shareholdings became possible by the end of the 19th century. People often shareholdings, again typo, often in their local brewery, and for rising companies such as Tetley, access to pretty cheap capital. Next, please. In addition, many pubs were being improved in appearance and quality, as reflected later in Tetley's Heritage Inn scheme of the 1980s. Which started in pubs such as the Garden Gate, Hunslet. There would have been a picture of Lord Mayor Harry Booth outside that, celebrating the change, being able to scan properly. The original Oak, Headingley with its bowling green, and the first acquisition of Tetley's in the 1890s, the Pack Horse opposite the University Engineering blocks, with still rather nice, garishly painted now stone carved horse over the lintel of the door. There was another major change to the drink market, which altered the market structure. And that was the development and licensing of clubs, a very distinctive feature of the drink markets as they developed in North and Midland England. By the time of the census of clubs in 1896, Leeds had around 70 clubs with 16,500 registered members, but with 15 of those 70 classified by the government inspectors as unruly. I remember, there may well have been some prejudice here. My recollection is I haven't been into those figures, those parliamentary papers for some time. I remember that the declaration of unruly was particularly applied to the 2 or 3 Jewish clubs. I wondered if that was, a nature of the inspector rather than the nature of the beast. Suggesting something perhaps, rather than that, of the secrets of the success of these unruly places as drink outlets. Much more fun, it sounds like. Next one, please. The consequence of market change lay in the creation of a system of the system of tied houses. This had begun in the later 18th century, mostly from the great London highly capitalized brewers, pioneers, where they controlled their drink outlets through loan ties. In other words, they lent money from the brewery to publicans, tying them irretrievably to their suppliers. And people like Truman's were particularly well documented as exploiters of this opportunity in the late 18th century. By 1891, the top 7 brewers of Leeds owned 100 pubs, but with Tetley well behind the average, with only 9 and 1.1% of the total population of pubs. So they were behind the game in the early 1890s in terms of tied house provision. Their acquisition of pubs, however, was made with urgency rather than panic, but at some cost to profits. By the end of the 1890s, they'd acquired around 85 pubs, 17 off-licenses, and 100 other shops with the capacity to retail drink above all their beers. So there's a very dramatic change taking place in the 1890s with tied house systems, with relatively cheap access to capital with limited liability, and with Tetley engaging seriously in these changes. Next, please. The tied houses ranged across an impressive but largely Yorkshire territory at the end of the 1890s. Knaresborough, Harrogate, York and Scarborough marked the northern frontier of the Tetley Empire. Huddersfield, Brighouse, Bradford, Shipley and Bingley covered the west. Dewsbury, Wakefield, Castleford, Ferrybridge and Snaith the south, with Leeds, as we discussed just now, the dominant core of the brewing business. Next. By 1890, Tetley had acquired an extensive network of stores, warehouse depositing stores in London, Liverpool, Manchester and York, the first in Pancras Road, obviously relatively easily accessible to rail supply from Leeds. They had also developed a system of agencies which, as they advertised, could be served by dray anywhere within 20 miles of Leeds. Now, it's a fair trek with a dray carrying beer. And of course, what they did much more was to dispatch beer by train and the drays and draymen by road. And they picked up the beer at the station where they competed. These agencies covered Barnsley, Boston Spa, Filey, Hull, Ripon, Scarborough, Whitby and Skelmanthorpe. I couldn't actually make a descriptive term for that mix of places, except that they're places for Tetley agencies. This structure saw them through the First War and into the challenging interwar conditions when they displayed better profitability between 1926 and 1938 than the majority of brewers in the UK. So whatever they had been doing, slow to engage in tied houses, slow to tie, but by the difficult conditions of the interwar period, they were doing relatively well. Thank you, please. These changes altered their position in the northern markets. However, by the early 1920s, Tetley produced a trademark which became both iconic as an image and confusing for the Yorkshire holidaymaker. That trademark, the familiar huntsman, everybody know the huntsman? Yes. Was designed, there would have been a picture of course, was designed by an agency in the southwest, Corston and Sons, and was commissioned by the Dorchester brewers, Eldridge Pope. And it said, and it was always being said, that this confused the holidaying Yorkshiremen in Dorset, if some people went, who spotted the huntsman and expected to be able to purchase the requisite quantities of Tetley's beer, only to find it was Eldridge Pope, over which opinions might vary. The two companies agreed this was confusing, and they agreed in a piece of anti-competitive behaviour, I suppose, to divide their territory for this emblem. And they agreed in the 1920s not to cross the Wash with its use. There was a whole series of possible puns there that I shan't explore. But no huntsman south of the Wash for Tetley, it's none north of her. Next, please. Post-war, the conditions are very interesting, and Tetleys are doing really rather well in terms of performance. In 1946 and 1960, Tetleys acquired 776 pubs from 7 brewers, including Melbourne's and Leeds, with 245 acquired in 1960. Added to this came the merger or acquisition of Walker Kane of Liverpool and Warrington into a new parent company, Tetley Walker Limited. And this gave them a total suddenly of 2,771 tied pubs. An extraordinary post-war growth. At roughly the same time, Tetley Walker were engaged in defensive talks with Eind Coop. And that led in 1962 to the creation of Allied Breweries. This developed in 1981 into Allied Lions, creating the largest national brewery with capitals of £126 million and 9,500 licensed houses. It's moved from pretty modest in 50 years to a very large brewing company and pub company. This extensive market was served by large numbers of specialist draymen. The brewer's dray remained more efficient as a mode of transport, certainly in urban conditions, up to the 1940s, with its much better performance by all of the scientific investigation that had been done in university departments of agriculture and elsewhere than the internal combustion engine for urban stopping and starting type delivery. But it did, of course, require a specialist workforce. Many of the Tetley dray men, I think they were all men at that stage, we were talking about dray persons, were recruited to Leeds from the East Riding, whereas Steve Corns showed there existed a complex system, hierarchical system of adolescent and young males working as horseboys, horsemen on farms, characteristically following an unmarried lifestyle up to the age of 18 to 20, and then being forced to become downgraded as farm labourers if they wish to marry, or to migrate and marry in towns. And they were the people who were characteristically attracted by migration to the big city as they sought alternatives to the hierarchical structure of farm work. Now, as it happens, when I started working on this, I had no idea I was going to bump into someone I knew. Two examples of this were the Goodwill brothers of Malton, one of whom was killed in the First World War, the other became a prisoner. What was important for me as the father of a later yard manager at Tetley's, Bill Goodwill, a great friend of mine of ours in the past, who used to regale pub audiences with tales of driving missionary beards in the early lorries of the 1940s and 50s across the Pennines to Warrington and into Lancashire. In every way, this family indicated the spread of the business and the fundamentals of strong labourer and skills in the operation of a successful distribution business for bulky and heavy materials. Next one, please. So I think we're pretty well getting to the end. The competition continued, and Allied merged with the Danish giant Carlsberg after 1981. I suspected at that point, I'll explain more when we finish, that might well be the death knell of Tetley's, with a large amount of inner urban land and a foreign owner, principal owner. And that led, sadly for many, to the cessation of brewing in this city, although it has been revived 10 years later. Changes of taste accelerated the adoption of new products and structures. Obviously, among those was the breathalyzer, which kept some people at home. Increased television viewing raised levels of bottled consumption and tinned consumption in the houses and in the pub, where Tetley's mild had once ruled many consumers. Bitters and keg beers, wines, and bottled products marked the transitions into the present century. I'm sure Joshua would have been, that should be it. Yes. So I wanted to add a little postscript to this, in the sense that I first came into Tetley's, I suppose my first encounter was in a glass. But in 1992, Victor Watson and Peter Collins of Leeds Chamber suggested to my late colleague, former colleague Katrina Honeyman, and myself, that we should try to do something celebratory of characteristic Leeds industrial enterprises to celebrate the centenary of the city, which was about to come up in 1993. What was very interesting, and I was reflecting on this when preparing for today, I did 2 of the chapters with research assistants from a couple of colleagues. Steve Corns, who I've mentioned, on horses, covered Yorkshire Post newspapers. Sue Bowden with Ron Crawford and Graham Sykes did the public supply of gas. I did Tetley's and Waddington's. Katrina did Montague Burton and Soapy Joe's, Joseph Watson's, and Penny Wainwright did Thackeray's. And what I suppose you will all have noticed, as I do every time I open this book to try to read myself or one of my former colleagues, everything has gone. Even as I was writing the last few paragraphs of my Tetley contribution, I was tempted to speculate on whether Tetley's would still be a characteristic name in beer in Leeds, much beyond 1993. And of course, it still is technically, but there isn't really much of a presence. And the brave attempts, maybe foolhardy attempts of Tetley's to create the sort of fairground experience with Tetley's Brewery Wharf, delightful Shire horses, nice to visit, but really not to do with brewing in a real market sense. That was very striking. And every time I think about these things, Mike Collins, hello, colleague at Leeds, was writing when he wrote the history of the Leeds Perm, who were again very helpful sponsors of this, suggested as a sort of recurrent theme of the history of the Leeds Permanent Building Society that they kept on being a sort of reluctant brides who started their way up the aisle and turned away before they got to the front end. And they had merger talks and promised mergers for 3 or 4 times before they actually did it with the Halifax. And of course, both, if in reality, no longer there. Public supply of gas. Leeds was splendidly proud of having a reputation nationally of having the dirtiest town gas in the country. We had great pleasure in trying to write that up, but as we were doing so, as this book was in proof, we found that the principal business of gas had moved as offices to the Midlands. And of course, since then, privatization has fostered overseas ownership. So really, while we have various gas companies associated with our city, none of them are Leeds. Tetley's, I've discussed. John Waddington's had Victor Watson used to tell lovely tales of going round with his dad, looking at places to put on a modern monopoly board. In London in those days, they've succeeded in, of course, producing a Leeds monopoly since, but it's all Hasbro, the American proprietors of all the games. And one of the things I found when doing research on that particular topic, the tantalizing experience, was being taken up at the Waddington factory with Victor or an alternative colleague, and walking around the warehouse stores to see, but not touch, piles of royal playing cards reserved for supply to the royal family. Board games galore. The one I was always imagining myself as a small boy wanting to play was called Dover Patrol. It had lots of battleships and destroyers and dice, of course. The whole thing in the same way. Katrina, of course, watched Montague Burton disappearing. Soapy Joe's, associated with Peter Collins through Unilever, had long gone, and effectively that part of an iconic Leeds name disappeared. But even Thackeray's, associated with Penny Wainwright, who the author of the study of Thackeray's, while we preserve it with their delightful, very important medical museum, Thackeray's have vanished and the company has been taken abroad. So in a sense, my musing about Tetley's has led me to reminisce, but also to ponder the factors of what characteristic industrial corporate names of the past in Leeds now survive, will survive, and perhaps to speculate rather pessimistically of whether this is a city that may not be able to hold on to everything it had. And obviously its pretensions in the early parts of this century as Britain's second great financial centre, that has been looking wobblier and wobblier over this period. So my apologies if this is a shorter talk than you've been anticipating. I could show you pictures. I have brought a couple of maps with me that you can pass around old-fashioned style to see where exactly the brewery. But basically, the site is as changed and developed in that way. But Tetley's did very well after a modest start, became very important leaders in lots of the corporate changes and tied house growth in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But then, like so many in the brewing trade, they found changing conditions and changing composition, particularly overseas investment into brewing, very difficult to cope with. I don't know what dear Joshua would have said had he been around, but no doubt he'd have been kicking the dog in Hampswade at the thought. So my apologies if it's a little shorter than you'd expected, but the alternative for the pictures would have been much longer. Thank you very much indeed.
respond to that most interesting talk. Well, the shortness of the talk has the advantage, it gives us more time for questions and discussion. Do we have any questions online?
Yeah, we do. Tracy Abraham has asked who painted the portrait.
Oh, gosh. Let me check with Clifford Lackey, which is where I was going to steal them from. The earliest Tetley portrait, one that would have been on the left had it been up correctly. It was in 1849. It was painted by Frederick Tatum. Mrs. Tetley was painted Hannah Carbot. We don't have an artist's name. And Sarah Ann Tetley, the one at the bottom, a cousin of Joshua, who married Joshua's brother. And again, we have an acknowledgement of Mrs. Noel Tetley for use of the picture, but no artist named. So rather difficult. But obviously, one of the things you'll notice is how important Tetleys as a family were in our city, with Springfield Mount, now the teacher centre, a Tetley house, ultimately Adel Manor, acquired by the Tetleys. Tetleys almost perpetually on the council of the University of Leeds, very important city figures, which is why I suppose it was so disappointing to realise, as we were about to publish this as a celebratory book about the city, that we realised that many, if not all, of the families we'd been talking about were gradually fading away.
It's the second one.
Yes.
And Jackie DePel has asked, did the affordable share purchase initiative apply to railways too?
What happened was that during the late 1880s, corporate law changed, and there was a general adoption in British commercial law of generalised limited liability. In other words, limited companies could limit their liability for asset and prosecution. Many of them took the opportunity to issue new cheap shares, not all penny shares, but cheap shares. And these were things that many ordinary folk felt they could have a little flutter on. And that, of course, had the effect of producing big flows of large numbers of small shareholders into many companies. It was similar, I suppose, with early football clubs. Lots and lots of people will have known, old folk who could still wave share certificates for their local football club. I remember, where I grew up, lots of people. There were more Brentford shareholders than Crowds, because they had been through this process between the 1890s and the 1920s. So limited liability made for a lot of cheap and easily available capital for lots of the expanding brewers. It must have been very hard to manage as financial directors, but it did mean that was where some flows of funds came that helped the acquisition of more and more tied houses at the time when the publicans were being squeezed by awful things like temperance, not quite as dramatic as Robert Arthington, but squeezed by temperance and changing cultures of drink consumption.
So, questions in the room? Yes.
The Tetleys came from Berkhamshire.
Yes.
Can you repeat the question, John? Because people on
Sorry. I've been asked whether the Tetleys originated in Berkhamshire. That does seem to be the case. And in a sense, Berkhamshire, Armley was really the territorial base for quite a time. But in the second quarter of the 19th century, with the development of the brewery site at Salem, the Salem Chapel, they become more and more Leeds folk, and they develop their associations geographically with Headingley, with Adel in terms of the acquisition of Adel Manor, and various other things in this way. But yes, they are maltsters and general dealers who come to specialise through their malting business, integrating into beer production, and the transitions then take place from there.
Why don't we build a brewery in Berkshire?
What would you?
Oh,
Oh, thinking about.
I'm born in Berkshire, so
Well, all I can say to that is drink their own beer, lad. Think about it, comparatively low value as a commodity, high bulk, big transport costs. The obvious thing to do is to get where you can have the most easily facilitated transport for distribution. And the Leeds base provided a territorial base for covering the area that I described, with the railway sending beer up at the weekend on Sundays, or with the drays going up to join them and to do the distribution in the area around, and then return with the empties. It's central place theory, much more efficient in terms of distribution than many others. Though, however attractive Berkshire might have been to dear Joshua and his dad.
Any more questions? Yes.
When Joshua Tetley started, did he buy any district?
Yes, the original.
Sorry, the question again.
Sorry.
John.
When Joshua started, did he buy an additional brewery? Yes, the brewery had started at the end of the 18th century with Sykes. Tetley's acquired that brewery, but then improved and developed both the site and the facilities. And really from around the late 1880s, symbolically, the first of their many tied houses was the house called the Duke William, which is in the site of the brewery, was in the site of the brewery itself. I'm not sure which Duke William this was. I mean, the obvious Duke William for me as a historian is the chap who came from Normandy, the ex-Norman. I can't imagine that Tetley's would have called a pub the Duke William after that. William of Orange? Seems unlikely. Thoughts on Duke William? I will be very well.
William in Berkshire.
Is
It's now a Chinese takeaway.
is there really?
For a long time, it was
Now, the other thing, we've obviously got a new field of research here. What should we call it? Batty names for Yorkshire pubs. I said Duke William, that may have been a reference. Going back to your original question, the Duke William in Berkshire may be a reference that was being kept in the family by the pub in the purview of the brewery itself in Salem Chapel, near Salem Chapel.
Maybe William Duke of Cumberland, the massacre of the Scots at Glencoe.
Well, I agree that's an excellent thing to celebrate, but I'm not quite sure that it's the best way of marketing your beer.
That would be the sort of thing that maybe people would work for.
I should emphasise that John is expressing an impersonal opinion here, not pursuing the thoughts of society when he says that. Any more questions? Kevin?
I'm going to come near the microphone
Right, okay.
because it's more observations rather than questions. I was reflecting on your comment about how all the businesses in Leeds City Business, that volume that you were involved with, have disappeared. And of course, I reflect on the fact that when I became director of Leeds Civic Trust in 1987, one of my missions was to get as much contact with Leeds City business as possible, in essence, partly to get them as sponsors of the Civic Trust. But in Tetley's case, they were enormously helpful to us. And before we bought our building in Wharf Street, I had just negotiated with them to acquire 2 offices at a peppercorn rent at the brewery, from which Leeds Civic Trust would expand. But throughout my time at the trust, we had extremely close relations with Joshua Tetley's. And so when I sit down and write my memoirs, the various changes and problems and issues that they had are very interesting. Reflecting on the book, though, the fact was that virtually everybody you referred to in that book, I met and had strong relations with their managing directors and saw, as it were, the rise and decline. And I thought that actually, from a Thoresby Society perspective, there is a conference, literally a really wonderful day to be devoted to what happened to those firms. I mean, I just think you commented that Thackeray's had disappeared, whereas, of course, in practice, they were taken over by the company which is now known as Dupuy, which is in South Leeds and employs about 800 people. So, we're still manufacturing those magical hip replacement joints and things like that. But going back to Tetley's itself, one of the things that struck me, and which no doubt you may well expand on, is the fact that, of course, well, in the early days, having got in touch with Tetley's, from time to time, I was privileged to go to the Tetley's managing directors' lunches. And basically, you'd go to their boardroom and there'd be what I think maybe about 12, maybe 14 of us in the room. And then Philip Butler, who felt like you were going to meet the emperor in charge of his domain, and he would be there. And then every guest was sat next to one of the senior executive of Tetley's, and it was all about public relations. And in those days, each senior director of Tetley's was given a day a week to go out in the community to serve as magistrates or to support causes, so that the head brewer, Dudley Mitchell at Tetley's, was assigned to be the Tetley's liaison with Eye on the Air, which of course was promoting the regeneration of the River Air in Leeds, and which of course I was director of for about 6 years. But the point was that Tetley's, was a huge empire. We're talking about, the late 1980s, I suppose, early 1990s. And as you say, but one of the critical parts of their downfall was the issue, of course, it was the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, wasn't it? In which they said that it was not right that breweries across the country should have all these tied houses. And therefore, they had to set up, you know more about it than me, John, but they had to set up the Tetley Pub Company so that the brewing arm of Tetley's was separate from the pub owning arm. And of course, well, you might like to say more about it, but of course, that in the end brought decline.
And it was very interesting the way they, Kevin was asking about the extent to which changes in regulation of the state accelerated the decline of Tetley's as a closely associated Leeds business. And it is clear that the tied house could really not be represented as anything other than anti-competitive. That, after all, was what it was for. People in that sense were right in that way. No equivalent operated in other parts of the drink industry. And as Kevin will know, and some of you may not, my perhaps bigger commitment to the drink industry is gin. And I have visited, on the same basis as I visit a fair number of breweries, gin distilleries in London and elsewhere, in quest of their archives to work on the development of the gin industry from the late 17th century onwards. Some enchanting and very attractive. Plymouth, a nice gin, one of my favourites, but also a very nice archive, very helpful. The producers of Beefeater were also boroughs, were very helpful in many ways. And I found that the brewers Watney, who by that stage owned a number of distilleries in Hammersmith, they were very accommodating about space and put me in touch with their archivists over things in that way. But clearly, corporate structures in the drink industries changed very fast, far faster than people could cope with. And I don't think I could envisage a way in which the most brilliant business person could have responded successfully to those market and regulatory challenges at that time. What is consistently baffling for me is quite why so many overseas capitalists, venture capitalists especially, find the acquisition of UK firms so attractive today. And you can hardly turn around without seeing the disappearance of the effective financial ownership of a company. And I suppose the answers are that if, as Kevin has been suggesting, if regulation caused the dissolution of the great brewing empires in the 1970s and 1980s and a bit later, then the absence of regulation, I don't sound too much like Gordon Brown, the absence of regulation of foreign ownership of companies and the ease with which acquisitions of shareholdings on very large scales could be made is part of the, or simply expresses the vulnerability of a large number of companies, perhaps that many of us grew up thinking of as being characteristically UK-based industrial commercial companies.
Morrison's been the most recent.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Morrison's is a very interesting case. It seemed to me that Morrison's took a very different path to the grocery business. They integrated vertically into farms and food production with high quality, but they have been bought for pennies, as far as I can see. And while I'd love to think I was wrong, I think it's hard to see a Morrison's we would recognise as surviving in 10 years' time. One of my friends, a cricketing crony, works or used to work for Asda, and described at some length to me. I gave a lecture on their history to a gathering of trainees at Asda at one stage. How the associated dairies became so successful as a supermarket business, giving good value, good products and other things. And the Walmart acquisition baffled lots of the existing workers at Asda. They couldn't understand why an American company who they seemed to think was entirely populated with really rather dim people, was trying to run Asda. And of course, it's going out down the river now, I think, as we see. And I hope I'm wrong. But Asda, like, the Walmart, the acquisition of Asda has been a very damaging force. And I suppose it simply shows us that I used to be able to argue, and Kevin did in his days with the Civic Trust, that Leeds had great facility with its footwork, It was dexterous, it could change, it converted its old mill buildings into very attractive new manufacturing plant. Are the tricks that we as a city were able to play for so long no longer relevant? I don't know, and I don't propose to speculate, except to say it's an issue.
I'll just make a final comment. What I was thinking about, the precipitative decline of Tetley's, that is the most remarkable
Yes.
thing. And you refer to Brewery Wharf, you know, their
Yes.
brewing museum. I mean, that apart, and I assume that's the early 1990s,
Yes.
isn't it? But at the same time, and what is remarkable, that Tetley's built a brand new £10 million brew house. I can't remember precisely the year, but it's about, you know, it might be about 1993-ish, something like that. Indeed, they were so excited that as part of helping the Civic Trust, we had a carol concert in the brew house with the glugging going on, with all this wonderful, you know, stainless steel in there. But the decline, and one of the things you mentioned, Asda, of course, when the Royal Armouries was coming to Leeds, this created great excitement.
Yes.
And the point about Tetley's was they were saying, just down the river, we've got the Royal Armouries Museum. That is a big attraction. We can have our brewing museum.
Yes.
And also at the time, there were discussions with Asda, who were going to open Food World just next door to the Brewery Wharf itself. And then, of course, you say it all collapsed. And I suppose it's this separation between the brewing and the pubs that allowed Domec. I mean, the point at which they stopped brewing Tetley's beer in Leeds, I'm not quite sure. But I mean, the brew house was, I suppose, opened and closed within 10 years.
It hardly got value for money, did it? And I think that the problems of so many of these companies has been that the international market has moved faster than they could possibly manage. The UK has become, at the same time, more and more finance-based and less manufacturing-based. Many will have views about why manufacturing declined as fast as it did during the 1980s. But it's very hard to reverse once that slippery slope is engaged upon. And I was consulted by Tetley's when they were planning Brewery Wharf. I said, what a lovely idea. I love the horses, but, you know, will it run? I did actually say to them, I had serious doubts as to whether that, with its associated interesting features of south of the river, whether that would build into what it really needed, which was a mega tourist business. And certainly Peter Collins used to talk endlessly about the marvels of the Royal Armouries. I don't want to criticise Steve's former employers, but the Royal Armouries really wasn't that exciting as a national tourist attraction, I don't think. Quite interesting in some ways, a nice site. But basically, if you're thinking about setting out an itinerary for the foreign visitor coming on holiday to the UK, you'd have to be a very, very imaginative travel agent to get Leeds in the top 10 locations, I think. A pity, much to show them, much to enjoy, not exactly a tourist trap.
Do you have another question online?
There's two. I'll give them both quickly. First one from Janet. Might the Unruly Pubs Association with the Jewish communities be related to desire to drink on Sundays? And then Clive Woods says, do other countries regulate acquisitions by these venture capitalists?
It's interesting. I think that corporate capital is more restricted in some other countries. It was part of, I suppose, the zeitgeist of the 1980s that the market was perfect and should never be interfered with, and that market perfection would lead to the proper outcome for a thriving capitalist Britain. So, I won't suggest the authors of those thoughts, but I don't think that works as well as some of the more closely regulated European competitors. Although I suppose untrammeled capitalism has worked in the United States since the days of Teddy Roosevelt attacking the robber barons of American railroad companies. So I think there is a genuine problem there. The other question was...
Oh, just deleted it.
No.
Was the Unruly Pubs Association to Sunday trading? No,
No.
Sunday licensing.
The club, they were unruly clubs, and it was quite clear that the inspectors were coming out to look at clubs because people were very concerned at what appeared to be a major change in the market structure for the distribution of drink. And clearly, the otherness of the Jewish clubs was very important for the migrant population who could relax and feel in that way. I have North Walian ancestry. My Welsh-speaking family used to delight in the fact that the visitors couldn't drink on Sundays, whilst we, of course, could, because we had the working men's clubs. It's a division of access to the culture, to the place, and to the beer and other drinks. And in a sense, that's where things were very different. What's interesting, I think, is no one has ever, I think, tried to work much on it. The thing I mentioned in my talk was the extent of what were known as licensed grocers. Grocers that held licenses for the distribution of alcohol were very important. And some of those were particularly important for some trades. Nicholson's Gin, whom some of you won't have heard, Nicholson's Gin produced in their brewery and distillery near the Angel, produced a very attractive gin. They produced a superior mark gin. What would you call a superior mark gin produced in London? Lamplighter. I've actually tasted Lamplighter. It's very hard to get it anymore. But clearly, some of these changing conditions were very hard to adjust to. And I suppose one sees the obverse of that in the modern trend for craft ales, for pub breweries, for craft and other gins and similar alcohols, all of which represent a reaction against the big corporate culture that changed the drink market so extensively between, I suppose, the late 70s and the early parts of this century. It's an interesting subject, but I do think the licensed grocer, which many of you may have heard of, is a disappeared circumstance because all grocers can sell booze these days, but was a very important part of drink distribution for home consumption. You sent the children with a jug to get beer from the licensed grocer to drink, as people did, because beer was family food and safe, better than the water. Oh, sorry.
I think we've just time for one last question. Any question, Rick? Well, can I thank you, John, for that most interesting and wide-ranging talk, which began with beer and ended with gin. Or that has been my preference is to tackle them in the opposite order. Thank you very much indeed, John.
Thank you.